Welcome, everybody. I do apologise. We're starting a couple of minutes late. This has been sort of heroic efforts on David Howarth's part tonight, trying to wrestle technology in a brand new room that we've never sat in before. So I'm very, very grateful to all his work. Hi, everyone. I'm Lynette Russell, and I am the leader of the Global Encounters project here at Monash. Tonight, we've got a really interesting talk. But before that, I'm just going to tell you that we are coming to you from the unceded lands of Naarm, the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people. Naarm is the traditional name for the meeting place that we now know as Melbourne. So tonight we're going to have Mark Vanderlock, and Mark is going to be speaking on They Thought This Man Was From the Heavens. Very pleased. Mark is from the University of Texas A&M, based in Qatar, and he's here in Melbourne for a little while. So we're really lucky to have him giving this talk tonight. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass this over to you, and then admit David, and then I've got to work out how to do.
Awesome. That's fine. I did just hear. It's no worries, no worries. All right. Well, thank you all for being here, and for those of you who are online. This is I haven't had a microphone in my hand for a long time. I might break out in a song here in a few moments. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here and to meet with all of you. And so, yeah, my talk is about. Oops, it was supposed to work. Let's try it again. Yep, here we go. They thought this man was from the heavens, and it's based on a book that I wrote, or at least it's a segment of the book that I wrote called Between the Floods. I have a picture of that later on, in which I described the history of the Arikara people. And in order for you to understand who the Arikara people are, here's a little bit of here's a map. And what we see here, this is of course the United States with all the, the different culture areas. The Arikaras are, if you can follow my cursor here, are located here in this area on the Missouri River, which is now in North Dakota, which is close to the Canadian border. So, but historically, they were from a place further south, right here in the middle of South Dakota, in Pierce, South Dakota, an area that is now basically or later claimed by the Sioux Indians. And we're going to talk more about that. Now, that means these are Great Plains Indians, and when we think of Great Plains Indians, we always think of, the horsemen chasing buffalo, etc. They also did that, but they were a agricultural nation, a semi-sedentary nation. That means they had villages where they grew corn and other crops, and I'll talk more about that here. I always put this picture in here because, people may be familiar with either the photograph on the right, which is a picture by Edward S. Curtis of a gentleman by the name of Bear's Belly here, dressed in a bear skin. He's a bear doctor or a bear dancer. And it's an iconic picture that you will find in lots of publications. So just to put this on the map. But many other people will probably or may have seen the film The Revenant, which came out, 8 years ago, thereabouts. And featuring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hardy. And I remember a good friend of mine, an Arikara fellow by the name of Lauren Yellowbird, and he's a very close friend of mine, sent me an email one day and said, look, dude, I just met Leonardo DiCaprio. He was the consultant, the cultural consultant on the movie. And so I was very much looking. He told me, don't tell anyone. It's still a secret that this movie is being made, or at least that it's what's happening with it. And movie came out, and it's a brilliant movie. The cinematography is amazing. Historically, there's a lot of inaccuracies, but I come to expect that from movies. What I did like about it is that it for the very first time we heard the Arikara language in a film. The Arikara language is almost extinct now. There are still some speakers left, although what we call speakers nowadays, they're really passive speakers. That means that the people who understand the language but cannot necessarily speak it very well. But anyways, just to give you an idea of who these Arikaras were and where they're from. Now, the important thing, and here's my book, and I'm going to plug it here for now. It's called Between the Floods, and it's a history of the Arikara people. And what's important about this book is that it almost didn't happen. There were all kinds of problems and issues with, including an intellectual property rights issue, which I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it was very frustrating at the time. And when I finally was able to send it out to the University of Oklahoma Press for review, the review came back like, well, this is great, except that it's not history, it's all anthropology. And I'm like, oh, well, I guess I must have done something right because I'm trained as a historian. But it delayed the book for a while. In fact, I thought of like just giving up on it altogether. But it turned out to be a lucky break, actually, because during that time, I was lecturing and teaching my students, and I always have them read the Arikara creation story. And at one point, this is after the peer reviews, the peer evaluations came out, and it's like, well, one of them said like, yeah, publish. The other one said like, no. And so I discovered that there's something more to these oral traditions. Now, in the past, I would use oral traditions simply as like this little sauce that I would pour over what I wrote, right? So I would write the history based on documents that I found written or unpublished, didn't matter. That's how you piece the history together. And then, you know, you look at what do the Arikaras say? And, oh, it's interesting. I'll put a little sauce on that and give it the flavor of authenticity. But I then realized at some point, like, wait a minute, there's something more to these oral traditions. There is a historical, you know, there are historical facts in them. And I was deeply influenced by a friend of mine. He's here in this picture, Roger Echohawk. He's Pawnee. The Pawnees are closely related to the Arikaras, both linguistically and culturally. And Roger had done a lot of work already on oral traditions among the Pawnees. And now, why am I telling you all of this stuff? Why, you know, and Roger's been a great influence. I'll have some more slides about that. Why am I telling you about oral traditions? Because in the book, actually, in the book, Between the Floods, the first half is based on oral traditions. So in the past, I would look at these oral traditions as like, you know, to just flavor the text a little bit. I then came to realize like, no, wait a minute, there's actually a lot more to these oral traditions than I realized at first. And I'll give you some examples later. And the second half of the book is based on oral history. So in other words, people who were there and their voices were recorded. And so they were direct eyewitnesses to these events. Excuse me. Now, Roger is important because he opened my eyes to these oral traditions. And he started off with, we go back to the creation story of the Arikaras, which starts with a flood. In fact, really quickly, when the creator, Neshanu Nachitaku, the great chief above, created the world, he created a race of humans or giants. And it turns out these giants didn't appreciate or didn't worship him. They thought they were just as good or better than the creator himself. So he destroys them in two fashions. The first time he destroys a group by turning them into stone, so they become mountains. And the second time he destroys them in a flood, and so they drown. And then finally, he creates a new race of humans who are placed inside the earth as seeds. As the world is covered in water, Wolf and Lucky Man, two characters show up, and Wolf is a trickster figure. That means, you know, a kind of like a silly figure, and Lucky Man is probably an incarnation or another manifestation of the creator himself. And they create land along both sides of what will become the Missouri River. And with the help of a duck. Now, this is very common stuff, but we don't know exactly what that means. It's just a cute story that people tell each other about like how the world came to be. So far, so good. Doug dives in, brings up the land, the earth, and so Wolf and Lucky Man create land on both sides of what will become the Missouri River. And this is, the picture here is a little bit strange because you have to tilt it a little bit to the left, but I wanted to get it nice and big. The land on the lower part was created by Wolf, and the upper part, it was created by Lucky Man. And you see the differences here. This is a map drawn in the early 1800s, 1804, 1805 by an Arikara chief who visited Washington, D.C., unfortunately ended up passing away there. But this is one of the maps. This is a map that he left behind. And if you tilt it, you know, the lower part is actually the eastern side of the Missouri River. This is where the Arikaras would settle. This is where the Sioux nations, the Lakotas, the Dakotas, the Yanktonais, and other nations lived. And on the west side is you know, you see all kinds of features. There's lots of nations living there. There's actually a city. If you go up here, this is Santa Fe. There's all kinds of different nations as well. This is a lake where a buffalo or some kind of horned monster lived. In fact, Wolf and Lucky Man had a little competition, and Wolf is the one who loses. He said, like, I created beautiful land on this side of the river. There's lots of buffalo there, etc. And Lucky Man says, like, yeah, but in wintertime, it gets really cold and nobody wants to live there except for barbaric people. And the civilized people, the Arikara people, will live on the western side of that. Now, the Arikara people come out of the earth, and there's a character called Mother Corn, but I'm not going to talk about her so much. But yes, I forgot that I put some kind of special effects in there. In any case, the people are put in the earth, inside the earth, as seeds. And at some point, as the water starts to recede from that, Mother Corn, basically a prophetess, what we call a culture hero, appears to the Arikara people and says, like, look, you need to come out of the womb of the earth. The Arikaras are an agricultural people. They look at the earth as the beginning place of all life. And so she coaxed them out of the earth, and finally a long-nosed mouse, or in some versions a shrew, digs the first hole, pokes through the earth towards the surface. A mole then shows up to make the hole a little bit wider, but is blinded by the light. And finally, a badger makes the hole big enough for all the people to emerge from the earth. Now, this is the classic emergence story. It goes on then. The people are still very, you know, uncivilized. They don't know how to survive. They're in a place that's not very hospitable, and they come across a big lake. And a loon here in the lower left helps them to cross that lake by creating a path, by moving through the water, by creating a path in this lake for the people to cross. Eventually, they come to a great ravine, a chasm a big hole in the ground, and Kingfisher then creates a space for them there, collapsing the banks, creating a bridge for them to cross again. Finally, they go through a woods, and an owl creates a path for him there. Now, when I first read this, and I read this story 40, 50 times, I don't even remember how often I read them, it made no sense to me. So yes, this is a great example of how I use oral traditions. I would start with that very same story that I just told you and say, like, well, this is how they looked at it. And I can tell you about, like, well, this tells us a lot about their way of life, right? They believe the earth is you know, that's where everything life emerges from. The people are related to these animals because the animals, as they come through these stages, they say, like, we stay behind, we remain burrowing animals, or we are water animals, or, you know, so it tells us a little bit about how they view their environment. And that's all great stuff. And it's all true. Okay. So that's very much part of Arikara culture. But Roger opened my eyes to this idea of, like, wait a minute, maybe this is not just a story of like, you know, human development and things like that, and how culture and civilization, maybe there's a historical truth to this story. And then we get to, for example, this is not mine, this is Roger's assessment, or at least theory, the loon crossing the lake. Well, if you read the stories, it says, like here, this is from Hawk. There are multiple versions of these oral traditions that were recorded. There was a wide, thick ice and deep water. And here's another one. They were upon an island in big water. So Roger then speculated that this was actually a story of what he calls deep time, of when the first peoples in the Americas crossed the Bering Straits, probably following loons and other animals, you know, that they were hunting into. Now, at this point, and I love Roger, I was like, yeah, I don't buy that. It's like, all right, it could be true, it could not, we can't prove it, right? But it was very intriguing, especially when you come to this area then, this chasm. Where does that come from? Well, Roger speculated that this was actually, you know, the story of the chasm with the kingfisher creating this bank. All the people who want to join me may remain here, and we will stay and make our home in these banks. And Roger speculated that this is actually the Grand Canyon, which I hope most of you are familiar with, right, from the movies, etc. And when I read this, and suddenly things started to click, and it's all hypothetical, of course. It's like, wait a minute, I remember visiting this place called Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado, where they actually literally have buildings, native people, the Anasazi had built dwellings in fact, this is called Cliff Palace, where they had built their homes there. What this tells me now, and again, this is speculation, I can't prove it really, because I don't have the definitive proof, although we may, with now genetic research, come closer to learn more about this. What probably happened, and this is what Roger already speculated, is that these people came across the Bering Straits, went south along the Rocky Mountains, the western slopes, then came to the Grand Canyon and places like this, went back up north until they finally reached the Missouri River. And if you look at the map, I have to go back up here a little bit. Should have done that differently. If you think about that, they would have come this way, southwest. The Wichita Indians, the Caddo Indians, the Quetzai, who are not listed here, and the Pawnees are all related to the Arikaras. And so they would have come down like this. What we do know for a fact then is that they have southern origins, even though the story suggests southwestern, okay? And as they moved on, certain parts stayed behind and built their own cultures in these regions. There's little doubt about that. In fact, there is now some genetic evidence that suggests that, yes, indeed, they were, that there is a clear link to Mesoamerica. Anyways, this is how I started the story, and the people settling on, oops, I should have done that, settling on the Missouri River, which they call the Sacred River. Okay, and that's where they built their gardens, their towns, their settlements. And here you see, this is from a George Catlin painting in about 1832. Catlin was too scared to set foot there because by this time, as you could have seen in the movie The Revenant, the Arikaras had a bad reputation of being aggressive, attacking traders and white people left and right. A reputation which is completely undeserved, but so anyway, so Catlin only painted it from afar. Corn was the most important crop that they grew. They would hunt buffalo in the summertime, but corn was the substance. Hence, we have mother corn. In fact, in the Arikara, or in the Plains Indian Sign Language, the signal for them is this, which is husking corn. In Plains Indian iconography, so paintings, pictures, etc., the Arikaras are always depicted as a man or a woman and an ear of corn, sometimes with a shoe that has these flaps, which are very typical of Arikara and Pawnee. That's how they are remembered. Okay, they were the corn people. Now you may wonder, okay, so far so good. Okay, what about these oral traditions? As I was going back over this after I published a second book instead of Between the Floods, because I was lecturing one time and it suddenly hit me. There's an episode in the creation story that talks about the people failing to worship properly. And because of that, a whirlwind comes around and starts killing people. And one of the people who's the informants here says, or collaborators, whatever you want to call them, says this was a disease and it scattered people, it killed people. The people were in panic, leave behind all of their towns, their gardens. They're in such a state of shock, they have to get out. And I realized that, wait a minute, the only disease that I know and that we for sure know existed in the Americas that caused such devastation is smallpox. Okay, now this is part of the creation story, which we think and Rogers, deep times, it goes back 10,000 years, etc. Wait a minute, this could be a reference to smallpox, the very first smallpox epidemic that hit the people, and they were not familiar with it, and that caused up to 50, 60, at this point, probably not yet 90% of casualties or deaths, but still a tragic number. I later on realized that they go to, I'm going to go back up here. Maybe I really shouldn't put in. Here you see a picture. I really shouldn't put in too many of these animations. I just realized, or I should put in more pictures. But what you see here in this photograph is an episode from that story, from that tradition. As they're hit by this disease, which I think hypothesize is smallpox, mother corn turns herself into a cedar tree, and out of the sky comes a rock, an incarnation once again, or manifestation of the great chief above, upon which the people then can find shelter. And some people still die, other people are scattered, but this is the place where they survive. I now realized that this is actually a reference, and I don't have a picture of that here. I gave a talk about this at Latrobe, but that this is actually the Black Hills of South Dakota, which is a place where, it has vegetation. It's covered by, it's a rocky area. It's covered by these trees. It's full of life, full of berries, if you leave your gardens, your corn behind, this is where you would go to survive, to sit out the storm. Anyways, let's go back. So I give lots of examples of these oral traditions that possibly have, I think they do, but it's, again, hypothesis, that have historical links, which brings us to another episode. And this is where I was going to talk about, and I think I already spent too much time, but in these same accounts, there is a fragment, and there's several, that talks about a mysterious stranger who appears. And this mysterious stranger, as I found out from another oral tradition, was Jesus. This is from Hand. This is when these oral traditions were for the very first time written down and published. Hand says, at this place, the people saw a man who was very tall and whose hair from his mouth reached down to his waist, and they exclaimed, wonderful. And they were afraid of him. They thought this man was from the heavens. And so in a later account from Frank Hart in the 1950s, who based this account on an earlier tradition from a Arikara holy man by the name of Two Crows. And Frank Hart actually explains that this was Jesus. Jesus appeared to the people, and they were so in awe and afraid of him because they saw that he was a very spiritual, powerful person, that they refused to welcome him. And Jesus was offended by that and leaves, but returns in one evening in a vision or a dream or to another person and says, like, look, you've offended me. I came to give you wonderful gifts. I have these powerful gifts and goods to give to you. But because you've offended me, now I'm going to take my goods to the white people, and they're going to be able to, become very powerful as a result. And you guys remain poor. And so now, the very first time you read this, and when I thought about this, and actually, I'm not going to read the whole quote here, but the very first time when I heard about this one, I was like, well, yeah, that's obvious. This was recorded in the early 1900s. By that time, the Arikaras had been exposed to Christianity, and so it's like, yeah, this was added to the oral traditions later on. In fact, one of the big criticisms from scholars is that you can't trust oral traditions, right? These are speaking animals. The craziest things happen there. Well, in my second book, which I'll talk about later, I actually discussed these things, that, wait a minute, these speaking animals, these witches, cannibals, all of these characters that show up can actually be explained. So I look at this too, like, how can we explain this? Well, yes, maybe this was apocryphal, which means, like, it was added to the story later on. For example, in the 1820s and 30s, Mormonism, or the Church of Latter-day Saints, came up as a religion, and they went out and believed that Native Americans were actually the ancestors of or the descendants of one of the tribes of Israel. And so Jesus appears to them, etc. And so you think, like, well, that's a logical explanation, right? They're exposed to Christianity, and so they add this to the oral tradition. But I'm not so sure about that. There are a couple of reasons why I think it's not, based on Mormonism, because first of all, Mormons didn't contact the Arikaras, at least not directly that we know of. Secondly, the Arikaras, as the creation story says, rejected Jesus at first, whereas according to the Book of Mormon, the Indians, the natives, immediately welcomed him and wanted to learn from him, etc. Even today, there's very few Mormon believers among the Arikaras. So then I started thinking, like, what is this? Okay, we talk about Christianity, Catholicism. Sure, yes. They actually go back to the early 1800s. There's, by the way, also a congregational minister who starts in 1876. But that's all very early. That's all very late. Then I start to think about, like, well, wait a minute. Jesus's message is not about like goods. It's not about material. It's about like peace. It's about love. It's about brotherly, turn the other cheek, all of that kind of stuff. It's not about like, here's wonderful things that make you powerful and militarily powerful, for example. It's a very different kind of message. And I started thinking about like, what could it be then? Well, this. Coureurs de bois, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, are literally, it's French for runners of the woods, wood runners, people who are traders, French Canadian traders who went into the interior of North America to contact Native American nations to trade. I don't really know, but it stuck with me because this is what I'm thinking about. This, I think, is what maybe the Arikaras saw at that time. They didn't see Jesus necessarily, although my friend Lauren would say, like, oh no, this is how the oral tradition, this is what it says. We ought to take that serious. This is literally Jesus. I think this was actually the very first time they met a white man, bearded, dressed in very strange clothing, and of course, carrying all kinds of strange, new, unfamiliar goods. By the way, in another book, there's a story, there's a wonderful Pawnee story in which once again, a kind of a bearded man appears, and mysterious man who has a magic stick that mysteriously produces food. Well, what magic stick produces food? A gun. And then he ends up killing an enemy and takes off his arm. And it sounds very much like the Beowulf story, but it turns out that arm was made of flint and looks like fish scales. Well, guess what? That's chainmail, introduced by the Spanish. And so suddenly, once you start reading these stories this way, they start to make sense. Okay, and then the end of the story, the Pawnee story says, like, well, and then this man turned into a cardinal, which is a bird which is red and has like a tuft on its head, a crest basically, and he has this black markings around his face. And that's when I thought of Pasquinel, right, from the TV series. Anyways, this is how I started to explain these stories. So how about Jesus now? Well, if Jesus was indeed one of these coureurs de bois that's unrecorded in history, I will have a hell of a time of proving that it was indeed a coureur de bois, of course, right? So yes, this is speculation. But it makes it plausible. I think it's a plausible explanation. When we go to the 1680s, in fact, I should go here first because La Salle was the very first who officially anyway descended the Missouri River and the Mississippi River. But he already is talking in 1688 about the Arikaras, or at least as one of the names they were known as, Paniasa, Pana, Paniloga, all related to Pawnee, with whom the Arikaras were closely related. And so he was familiar with these nations, even though he didn't sail up the Missouri River. The Missouri River is a branch of the Mississippi River. That's where the Arikaras ended up living. Perhaps more interesting, but also more problematic, are the voyages of Baron de La Hontan. He writes this fascinating book, and he describes the Iokoros, the Arikaras, in great detail. He tells them that they were numerous, there were lots of them. They lived in these semi-permanent, semi-sedentary towns. They grew corn. Their dwellings were like Catlin painted them. This is pretty positive indication that he was indeed talking about the Arikaras. Turns out he was a liar. He probably never visited the Arikaras himself, although he claimed he did, because there are too many inconsistencies in his writings, which is interesting, by the way, as I'm standing here thinking of I'm trying to defend oral traditions, right? It's like, well, there is something of truth in there, but the written tradition, wait a minute, here's a written tradition and it's false, okay? Yet the information that he got was probably from other coureurs de bois, who told him, look, there's the people who live there on the Missouri River. They live in these spherical kind of earth lodges. They grow corn. They're populous. They are able to withstand the Sioux Indians, etc. So he used that information and then presented it as his own, that he had witnessed it himself. So now we know that already in the 1680s, way before 1743, when we have the first documented encounter between whites, the French, and the Arikaras, we have circumstantial evidence that they had already met white people, okay? So we have to push the date back of this encounter between the Arikaras and white people. Here, this is just another example. By this time, there's lots of documents that talk about the Arikaras. And this one is interesting because this is Guillaume de Lille, who, based on these accounts, makes this map and says here there's a chemin de voyageurs, which means this is a road for the traders, the travelers, the traders who went out there. And it ends right here it says here, Panimaha, that's probably the Skidi Pawnee, the Pawnee, and here you see the Arikaras. So way before 1743, the Arikaras met white people. That's really the point I'm trying to make here. Who these people were, we don't know, or who this man was. So I suppose I need to explain, but then why does he become Jesus? Okay. Yeah, that's a question. The Arikaras and the Pawnees, in fact, I think most Plains Indians, if not Native Americans, all over the Americas, or certainly North America, believe in spiritual power as the defining way or a means to climb the social ladder. I always ask my students, I draw a social pyramid on the board, and I say, okay, in the United States, who's at the top of the pyramid? And everybody will say, it's Bill Gates, or it's Jeff Bezos, right? It's based on money. And then when I go to my Middle Eastern students, it's well, who's at the top of the pyramid? Okay, well, it's how close you are to the royal family. Okay, that determines your status in society, what they call wasta. Okay, this mysterious kind of system that they have, which I'm not part of. With the Arikaras and Pawnees and other nations, it's spiritual power. And how do you get spiritual power? You get it through either a vision. You can buy it from somebody else who can train you then in here are the secrets of what you need to do to be successful in life. The vision gives you, there's a third way, which I will discuss later. Okay, I'm saying that as a cliffhanger, basically. So when they discover these white people for the very first time, they have no idea what they're encountering. And so in their minds, the way I see it is like, yeah, they see someone who is special. Later on, he probably morphed into like, a god, or they wouldn't use the word God, but a spiritually powerful being, maybe even a heavenly being, okay? And so later still, when they are exposed to Christianity and they learn about Jesus, and then that mysterious stranger that comes in and has all these powerful goods becomes Jesus. Now, I have some more information. That doesn't last. The idea that white people are by the way, the Lakotas also, the Lakotas or Sioux Indians, also their word for white people is Wasichu, which means spirit. Okay, so that already separates this idea of like, these are not just ordinary human beings. However, they quickly learn, certainly the Lakotas do too, that yes, these white people are just people. They're just different. They're not necessarily, spiritually strong or powerful people. This is from 1795, 96. Jean-Baptiste Trudeau, who was another trader, a documented trader. He was trading actually well, even though he was French in origin, he ends up trading for the Spanish because the French had been kicked out of North America by this time. And so all the Frenchmen that were there now suddenly became either English or Spanish. And he talks about how the Arikaras now have a very different view of white people. They formerly called all white men spirits because of the powerful objects they carried. It is said that formerly they had such veneration for us that they honored us with a kind of worship, giving feasts in which they threw the first morsels into the fire as an offering to the white man. And they also threw painted ropes and dressed skins decorated with, et cetera, right? But then he goes on, now they think of us simply in connection with the merchandise, the goods, okay, that we bring them and that are so important to them. The guns that they need to not just hunt, but also defend themselves against other nations, okay? So the view of white people has changed. Now they're viewed as greedy people, as greedy beings. Nothing spiritual or divine about them. They're very human, okay? And not even very pleasant humans. So the view changes, but the tradition of that very first encounter with this mysterious stranger, it remains, okay? But by this time, he's not a white man, he's a person from heaven. Anyways, all of this circumstantial, but there is another episode that happens a couple of years later, in 1804, so 10 years after Trudeau writes about this. Lewis and Clark sail up the Missouri River. And then in order to find, the route to the Pacific, they end up in what's Northwest America, where they will eventually connect, as agents of empire. They have to tell the Indian nations, now we're in charge here. We're the great white father. They have to document what they see. They have to exploit, opportunities for trade, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On that trip, a very famous character, and I'm not sure which one is Lewis and which one is Clark, William Clark. They meet this lady, Sakakawea, who is very important in basically as an interpreter, starting to mediate between Lewis and Clark and the natives that they encounter. But I'm not going to talk about Sakakawea. I'm going to talk about this man here. This is York, and he was William Clark's slave. And so he went up with this expedition of about 30 plus people. It was not very big. And he's but he's Clark's slave. He's his personal property. But what happens when the Arikaras for the very first time see Lewis and Clark, they don't look at Lewis and Clark as like special. They look at York and they say, that man, we've never seen anything like that. And in the Arikara color scheme, this idea of like, colors have powers too, right? The whole universe is governed by powers. Colors have certain powers as well, and certain meanings. And the color black in our culture is that of mourning, right? We dress in black, and it's dark and grim. For the Arikaras, black was the color of victory. White is the color of mourning. So when they see Lewis and Clark, probably already looking a little bit pale because they've been, traveling and they look at York as the leader. That's the man. He's in charge. He's not a slave. He is the man in charge. And what happens next is that because York is big, strong, powerful, that's how he's described, not just by Lewis and Clark, but in the oral traditions as well. And because the Arikaras are looking for spiritual power, by this time, they have been locked into very small settlements. Diseases like smallpox have decimated the numbers. They can no longer move to the Black Hills because the Black Hills are now occupied by the Lakotas. So their place of refuge is gone, and they start dwindling in demographically. And they see York, a very strong and powerful man. And one way, which I didn't tell you last time, to obtain spiritual power through visions or purchase, but a third way is through sex. Okay? A man could obtain power from another man or even an animal by having his wife have sex with that man or being, and then you have sex in return later with your wife, and you can obtain that person's or being's power. So York was not viewed as a god or anything like that, but he was viewed as an exceptionally powerful being. There's and here you see it, like, right here's this episode with with the man dance where they actually rub his skin. Is like, is that just paint or is this real? And then they realize it's real. And so York is treated as almost as a king, may be the wrong word, but as a very powerful being. And I'm bringing this up, of course, because I started my story about, like, white beings, spirits and strange and mysterious. And this is this moment of discovery where they discover someone else. And in their framework, in their mind, York is not just an ordinary human. He is something else, something special. By the way, the story of York is very sad because William Clark thinks, York probably sired children all over the Missouri River with other nations as well. William Clark later gets very upset. In fact, there's a story of them. They move on to the Mandans. They will actually spend the winter among the Mandans. And they take one of the Arikara chiefs with them. In fact, the very same one that drew that picture earlier, this map. And Clark then says, like, York is getting uppity. He's getting rebellious. So he punishes him. He whips him in front of the Arikara chief. And the Arikara chief starts to cry and says, like, what are you doing? This is wrong. And I always bring up this story because my students in the Middle East, especially, right, but also my Catholic students back in the US, they were deeply scandalized by this whole idea of, giving your wife to someone for sex, and then to them that's scandalous, that's offensive. But then I tell them, like, okay, wait a minute, which one is more offensive? The people who believe that York is special and yes, you can obtain power through sex, or the people that consider him a piece of property that you can beat? And then you see their minds change, right? Their perceptions change, their ideas change. In any case, so I take this once again as, like, yeah, there is this moment of discovery when they see someone different, new, and they attribute power to this person. Eventually that becomes Jesus. Now, I had never heard, well, I'd heard of Marshall Salins, but I've never heard of the controversy with Captain Cook. In fact, I have no stake in this debate. But as I was doing my research, of course, I came across Captain Cook and the whole debate about, like, Marshall Salins wrote this book about Captain Cook, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it, and I'm all familiar with it, with the controversy, and said, like, well, the natives believed that he was a returning god and then had to kill him as a form of ceremonial sacrifice, etc. Okay, I think that's a pretty cool theory, but again, what do I know? I don't know. I don't know these cultures, right? And then there's, of course, the reaction by Gananath Obiasekere, and I'm not even sure I pronounce his name correctly, probably don't, who says like, but this is silly. This is all invented by white people to justify conquest, to justify domination, to justify colonization, to justify robbing, by treating them as a bunch of silly, illiterate and not clear, rational people who you can then, rob of their lands and possessions. And I don't want to take any sides in this debate, but if I look at the Arikara example, and if I'm right, and again, I want to emphasize it's mostly theory rather than, fact, or at least, hypothesis. When I look at the Arikara story, and if you take these oral traditions seriously, as I do now, then I think, wait, here is evidence that yes, they did view these very first Europeans, or this first European, as a spiritually powerful being, not necessarily a god. Okay, and later that he morphed into into Jesus. Okay, as they were, oh yeah, remember that time when we met this stranger? Oh, that sounds like Jesus. Okay, that's how I think this story can be explained. Now, and I also want to point out, and again, this is not direct evidence, but, and this is my second book, right? So as my first book, Between the Floods, was kind of like, I put it on ice. I was like, oh, forget about it. I'm never going to finish it. It's never going to be published, blah, blah, blah. This whole sob story. And I started thinking about like, what these oral traditions could mean. And I looked at different Caddoan, Pawnee, Wichita, Caddo, and Arikara stories. And I started with the whirlwind story that I mentioned earlier, but also looked at other stories. And it's like, wait a minute, what we think is mythological, etc., is actually historical. But we have to be more creative in the way we read these stories. For example, there's I'm probably running out of time. If I'm going too long, let me know, okay? If you want me to shut up, I'll be happy to. I'm starting to lose my voice anyway. But there's a wonderful story about a witch woman in a Wichita tradition. And she goes into this town and she steals a child and takes it with her. And the people are very upset and want to get the child back. And then they find someone, his name is Coyote, and Coyote is transformed and fantastic stuff happens. And he leads them to the witch woman and they recapture the child. Okay. And then he turns into a bird. Or actually he turns into an actual coyote. And anyway, really confusing. But there was one section in that story that drew my attention. And it was the fact that the witch woman had a mysterious torture pole that shot fire and rocks. Well, wait, that sounds like a cannon. Okay, it shoots rocks. It's like, grape shot or something. And so I started looking at all these, okay, well, who were the first people that contacted the Wichitas? Well, it's Coronado. Yeah, he had guns, but he didn't use them. Okay, well, there's several others. Then I come to 1758. And I'm like, by this time, I'm going to forget about it. This is not our story. By the way, I told this story the very first time in 2015, my first visit to Melbourne. And anyways, 1758, what turns out is that the Wichitas attacked a Spanish mission. A Spanish mission. And what they found there is that this mission, lots of Native American kids were left. In fact, the Apaches would rob these kids, from these other nations, drop them off there in return for money. At first, the Spanish missionaries don't want these kids. It's like, no, bring them back to their families. And then the Apaches say like, well, we don't want them either, crack. And they kill them in front of the missionaries. And then the missionaries say, oh, no, we'll take him. And some of these kids that they took were these Wichita kids. And then comes the interesting part where I think like, hey, I got that quote unquote smoking gun. They had a cannon there at this mission post. And the purpose of this cannon was not so much to shoot Indians, but as a sound of alarm, because there's a Presidio nearby. Yeah. Anyways, in the Wichita perception, the witch woman was the Madonna because they find a picture of the Madonna holding a baby. But in their mind, that's anyways. So the point of that is, and I conclude with this, is like, if these oral traditions can depict Europeans as demons, okay, as they do, cannibals, witch women, you name it, all described in this book, why not see them as not necessarily gods, but powerful people? Okay? The opposite. All right. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you. Oh, we have a chat window, right?
Yes, we do. And thank you. So Leonie's just made a comment, terrific talk. So thank you so much. Look, I'm not sure if our people on, I can see we've got on the chat or actually on the Zoom, can hear me. I assume you can hear me. I can't hear you. So we're going to need you to write any questions that you have here on in the meeting chat. And I can see a couple already. So I'm going to let you deal with that, Mark. It might be easier.
Right. The first question is, and you may be able to see it as well, and if not, so this is Leonie, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You touch on the paradoxical ideas of credibility where oral histories are seen as less credible, whereas European ones, even if dubious, still tend to hold power. Can you expand on this? Yeah. I'd be happy to. There was a time in the 1800s where scholars, anthropologists especially, and linguists were taking these oral traditions very seriously and were treating them as historical documents. But then there's an anthropologist by the name of Robert Lowy who comes around, and he says, like, no, that's all nonsense. We cannot believe that. All of that is just, it's just fantasy, right? They just make it up to explain things. And there's a big debate about that, and eventually Lowy kind of wins. Lowy's argument kind of wins, and oral traditions then suddenly become the realm of psychoanalysts, okay, like Carl Gustav Jung, who look at these things and are like, oh yeah, this is tells us about the deeper inner workings of these Native Americans, rather than as documents of history. And this has become a new topic. So I'm not the first one to do this. I'm not a pioneer. I've come up with some great ideas, but I'm not new at this. This was done earlier. But in the 1980s, when we have this debate about repatriation, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, right, which also says, like, you have to take oral traditions into considerations when you look at the human remains or artifacts that are left behind. And so it comes back, and we see, and for my second book, for this book here in the picture, Ronald Mason wrote a really good, fascinating book about, like, trying to discredit oral traditions. And he does a really good job. He does a really good job. It's not easy to refute it, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, we're still ignoring these sources then. One of the things he says, like, well, which is what Lowy said too, if there are fantastic characters, speaking animals, how can you take it seriously? And how can we take them, like, we have oral tradition A says this, oral tradition B says that. How can we then put any trust and faith in these oral traditions? Another example is that, human memory doesn't work that way. People forget, right? And so, yes, you make some good points. And at the same time, and once again, I learned this simply through experience, I suppose, my exposure to Native Americans, who always said, like, look, there's truth in these stories. And I just, like, yeah, okay, I shrugged that off. Then eventually I realized, yeah, maybe there is more to that. And so I'm kind of become an advocate together with Roger Echohog for, like, let's look at these sources and let's have a debate about that. We can at least have some fun in making sense out of them. And maybe, and I think we will, we can learn something from that. I hope that answered the question.
I think that's all we've got in the
Oh, no.
questions in the chat. That's
No,
okay.
there's a, I mean, Doug, is there a wider tradition of this sort of mapping?
Oh, the mapping.
Yeah. There are historians, at least I met some at conferences who are doing stuff on mapping. This is the oldest, well, this is the oldest one that I'm familiar with. There might be maps on petroglyphs, you know, inscriptions on walls and things like that. But we don't know that because in many cases, we don't even know how to read those things. And I'm not an expert on that. The gentleman who found this map, Christopher Steinke, found them in the archives in Paris, the National Library of Paris. And it was probably a gift from Jefferson to one of his servants, said, like, I don't know whether you take this, and he took it to Paris eventually. And then the last one, yes, we can. Okay, I think that's the question.
Okay, I think that is all the questions. Those of us who are in the room are lucky enough to be heading off for dinner with Mark, so we'll be able to ask him lots of questions, which I can see lots of nodding, so we're going to do that. I would like to thank you very much for coming in and giving us this talk. We really do appreciate it. And I'd like to thank our audience for being very patient. We've had quite the technical events here today. So thank you so much for bearing with us, and thank you very much for obviously staying online. You will be aware that we have another seminar next month. No, we don't have one next month, because I'm very excited to say that the Global Encounters team are heading off to Makassar and Jakarta to do more work. So the next one will in fact be in October. So thank you everyone for joining in tonight, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.